That's helpful.
All righty.
Good afternoon. Gosh, it's great to see such a large crowd out here on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. I hope you had an opportunity to visit the exhibits maybe beforehand. If not, please come back and do so. Welcome. My name is Bill Harris, and I'm the director here at the FDR Presidential Library Museum. And this is our second Paul Sparrow Lecture, we call it, but it's really going to be a conversation. Actually, both times it's been a conversation. So. But Paul was the director immediately before me. Many of you knew him or know him. And so he wasn't able to be here tonight. So I wanted to say, if he's watching, we miss you. Come back. He was a wonderful person to work with. And I had that privilege for 6 years. And this is an encore program with Jonathan Darman, whose book, Becoming FDR, usually I would have one, but I left it in my office to hold up, has been out now a few months, and you came previously to speak. Jonathan, just quickly, well, you were a journalist, political historian, we can call you now.
Yes.
Can't we? Yes, I saw that. That's a great title.
Political historian.
Yeah. And his book, Becoming FDR, is a nice update and a refreshed look at the transition, the crisis that had such a major impact on President Roosevelt's life. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. It's really impossible to write a book about Franklin or Eleanor Roosevelt without coming away with just a profound sense of gratitude for this place, for the vision that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had in creating the library, and in the stewardship of the National Archives and the Park Service and the Roosevelt family, and really continuing on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy. So it's just an honor to be here, and it's been wonderful to spend time researching in this library over the years.
Super. So what we'll do is we'll talk for a little while, and then I believe we'll have questions. Cliff can confirm that. And afterwards, there'll be a brief period, and Jonathan will sign a few books if you have one or want to step into the store and acquire one. So let's talk. That sounds very sort of 1975. I've asked you before, and you've talked about what brought you to this, but in this contemporary environment where there's so much talk about, it seemed like we went through this period where you didn't talk about character. And in the last 4 or 5 years, in the last several years, character has been a major part of our political discourse.
I don't know what you're referring to.
I can't comment on current events.
Yes.
So character plays a major part in this in a way, because the nature of the man of FDR and how we think about him evolved considerably in his view and approach of the world from before 1921 to after. How do you think his polio particularly impacted, or those experiences, his very nature, his character?
It's a great question, and I should say, even though I completely agree that the book I've written, which is about the way that polio transformed him, focuses very directly on the question of character, I didn't really set out to write a book about character per se. I wanted to look at, even though I was very aware that there were many, many wonderful books that had been written about Franklin Roosevelt, I wanted to look very specifically at the question of inspiring hope in the country. And that felt relevant when I started the book. It feels even more relevant now, because I think we have among all the many problems that our country is currently facing, we have a crisis of hopelessness and despair. I mean, you look at poll after poll, and people, the large majorities in this country say they think the country's best days are behind them, that we don't have what it takes in our system to address some of these problems that we're facing. And that becomes a sort of really nasty cycle where that sense of hopelessness makes it harder to then summon the political will. And so I wanted to look at FDR because I thought that he's basically the best example we have in our history of a president who is able to interrupt that cycle. right? So that's exactly what he's doing, starting at the very outset of the presidency when he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So I wanted to understand how he did that and see what, if any, lessons there are for today. And it was only in really thinking about that and then diving into the research that I came to see that really it came for him from the experience of getting polio at age 39 and of, staring down a sense of hopelessness himself in a very personal way, and learning from that experience and developing a pretty amazing set of principles for nurturing hope and sustaining a sense of possibility that he then brought to the country. So when I think about what really sort of remade his character in those years, that's the legacy that he then brings is that set of principles.
It's interesting too, in terms of character, but in what you just said, but cynicism is also very much at play and is always a risk. It's like a deadly virus which just floats around out there that can drag everything down. And this time period after World War I, during the Harding years, which were not exactly known for their forward approach to the world, and were certainly scandal-plagued, and there was this sort of deep political cynicism even at the time. And here he comes through this crisis, and out of it comes not more cynicism. I mean, he goes through a very difficult time, but on the other side of it, it's very opposite from cynicism.
And it's interesting because I think we think about Franklin Roosevelt as someone who is excellent at reading the public mood, which he was. And we think of a political natural as someone who's paying very close attention to the currents in public mood and sort of positioning himself in that way. But if you look at that period you're talking about, and which is really the heart of the book that I've written in the 1920s, it's the moment in Franklin Roosevelt's life where he's stepping farthest outside of the culture. In the mid-20s, as he's in the process of working on really devoting much of his life to rehabilitating from the effects of polio, what does he do with a large portion of his own personal capital? A lot of the people in his social circle were putting it into the stock market, and making plenty of money on that, which if they got out at the right time would have worked out well for them. But in Franklin Roosevelt's case, what does he do? Is he buys Warm Springs, which I think he had sort of vague ideas might be a moneymaker, but no one else around him really did. And it wasn't about that. It's about something outside of himself. So the 1920s, which is this sort of quintessential moment of selfishness and consumption in this country, is the moment where he is really connecting with the part of him that can be of service to others. And it's that moment of stepping away that really makes him quite prepared to be the person who can step into a position of leadership when the mood in the country changes after the crash of the stock market in 1929.
So after they returned to New York, after they returned to New York, he's bedridden, paralyzed, depressed at best. And we can go into that in a moment because we think about character building in certain ways, but suffering from a depression brought about by this fundamental change in his entire view of the world, of himself.
Yeah.
So what is it like just during this interim period? Campobello, which has been covered in many ways in terms of he gets the illness that's somewhat in the New York City. And then immediately afterwards, when he goes to Florida, after the New York period, what's happening at that period? How is he coming to terms, or how is he thinking about this?
Yeah, I think my appreciation for that period was really informed by getting a broader understanding of who he was before polio and what his public identity was. I think a lot of people don't realize this necessarily, that he got polio in the middle of life. I think because polio is a illness that we associate with childhood, a lot of people actually think he might have had it all along. He didn't. He got it at age 39. Before he got polio, his whole identity in politics had been as a sort of Democratic Teddy Roosevelt for the next generation. He used his physical presence to his advantage masterfully.
Yeah, he was 6'2", athletic.
Yeah, and just really nice to look at. And he moved very elegantly. He was always running around. He was great at sort of, he was nice to look at on a dance floor. And those things really helped him in his political career. I mean, I start my book talking about him at the 1920 convention, jumping over rows of chairs, stealing signs, starting fights, and people think, "Ooh, there's a young man in a hurry." You know, that really works for him. So then when he gets that diagnosis in the late summer of 1921 of infantile paralysis, he had lost the ability to walk. He doesn't know at that point if he's ever going to get it back again. He's not just losing the ability to walk, he's losing what has been his whole sort of public image. And so it's no wonder that everyone around him, for the most part, with some very important exceptions, sort of thought, okay, this is the end of his political career. So, you know, I thought about what would that be like to be in the middle of your life and to think that it is going very much in one direction and all of a sudden have it wrenched away by something you didn't see happen, especially when you're Franklin Roosevelt, where a lot of your life up to that point has been about a pretty clear plan and following the path of his noble cousin Teddy and sort of trying to get to the White House in the way that Teddy Roosevelt did. What is that like to have uncertainty wrench your whole plan out from under you? And what does he do in that moment? And I think what's inspiring about this story is he doesn't, even though he experiences some moments of profound depression in the early days, he doesn't give in to that despair. He actually looks deeper into himself and becomes, in a lot of ways, a new person.
What do you think about the Florida excursion, the long sort of summers of his existence, fishing and, frankly, drinking and partying with friends, close associates on a houseboat down in Florida? Do you think that reflected a depression or unsure nature of the future, or was that a way for him to just totally disconnect and then rebuild it?
See, I think that's the moment where some of the most important work is happening. There's a line that I start at the beginning of my book, and that I always talk about from Louis Howe, who, for those of you who don't know, was the Roosevelts' very close political advisor in this period, where he talked about the early years of Franklin Roosevelt's recovery from the effects of polio, and he said a year or two in bed should be prescribed for all our statesmen. And I often say I can think of one or two of our statesmen that I'd like to send to bed for a year or two. But I actually think it's a, so I use that as a joke, but I think it's actually a pretty profound observation. If you think again about who Franklin Roosevelt had been, Howe described him as someone who was always running off somewhere and could always distract himself with something. He is forced by circumstance in that moment to sit still, really for the first time in his life. As Howe said, he had nothing to do but think. And it's in that experience of stopping that he gains a new insight and a new, I think, depth of character. And so when in the years that are spent, or the months that are spent on La Rocco floating around in the sun in Florida, it doesn't look like the making of the president. But it's actually, I think, this sort of great meditative space that he enters there. I know a little bit about Buddhist meditation, and there are two sort of pillars of it. One is insight, and the other is stopping. And Thich Nhat Hanh had this line, which is, we spend our whole lives running. Practice stopping. That's what happens to Franklin Roosevelt here. He's practicing stopping, and I think that's really where he's gaining a lot of this insight that he's then going to use when he gets into office.
That's interesting, because the New York period is sort of this struggle, overt. Do you just now accept that your life is changing? You stay here, you become your gentleman farmer.
Yeah.
Your public life is over, or no. You've got to continue. We'll find a way forward with a political life. You've got this sort of, and then he's he's having that battle.
And I think that my view is that this is a pretty bold choice that he makes, because the most famous voice of the former position you were describing come back here to Hyde Park, live a quiet life as a country squire, is from his mother, who I'm hesitant to use her name around here.
I love to use her name. She's
I just don't, and
she's wonderful.
if she doesn't like anything we're saying, she'll make her presence known. And
remember, we've got her great.
I know, I'm very aware. But I think she was, she felt strongly that, okay, you've had this political career, why don't you come back and live a quiet life? And then there are others, chiefly Louis Howe, who comes to him and says, look, I know these other people around you are saying that your political career is over. I don't believe it's over. I believe you're not only going to return to politics someday, I believe you're going to be the president of the United States. And I've got a detailed plan for how you're going to do it. We're going to devote as much of your life in the next couple of years to getting as much rehabilitation as you can. We're going to find other ways of keeping the Roosevelt name out there in front of the public. And then ultimately, you're going to return to politics. You're going to run for governor, and you're going to run for president of the United States. And in Howe's recollection of that, FDR's response is, when do we start? And I think that's the moment where you see this change starting to happen, is he is not going for the easy thing. He is going for the hard thing. And he understands full well how hard it's going to be.
Well, and Louis Howe then is, one can think of him as a remarkable visionary, because there wasn't really disability as a notion really meant that if you were not hale and hearty and healthy, then you were no longer public in many ways, that you were over here.
Yeah.
You were retired. It was over.
I think it's hard for us to get our heads around, because we've come a long way with the way we think about disability, even in the last 30 years. I think in the 1920s, the best you could hope for in a lot of ways was pity. And I think, and this is another thing that I really admire about Franklin Roosevelt in this period, is he was not someone that people thought of as your typical polio victim. There are a lot of letters that he would get from his friends where people would say, you're the last person I would have thought would get infantile paralysis, because it was an illness that was associated with children. And it was an illness that was associated with urban poor, a lot of them recent immigrants to the United States. And so even though it was announced to the public that he had had infantile paralysis, from that moment on, he was under no obligation to continue to identify with polio. He could have just been someone who was an invalid, and not let me really emphasize what it was that had brought that on. But instead, he really does form this incredible connection with other polio patients in these years. And this was for me a really enlightening part of the research, was to look at that and see how early it starts in FDR's recovery. When it gets announced to the public in the fall of 1921 that he has had infantile paralysis, people start writing letters to him. Some of them are polio patients themselves. Some of them are family members who have had a loved one who had polio. And some of them are asking him for advice about what he's doing to get treatment, but others are offering it. And one letter that I always think about, that I always come back to, is one that I read here in the library from a gentleman who had also gotten infantile paralysis as an adult, and had been a railroad worker in Massachusetts. So very different background from Franklin Roosevelt's. And that gentleman had spent 7 years in a hospital and was completely paralyzed. And in his letter to FDR, he wrote about the ways that rage and fear and shame had impeded his recovery. And he says in the letter, he says, Mr. Roosevelt, whatever you do, don't worry, it won't help any. And I say this a lot, but it's true. That's really the moment. Reading those words is the moment that the book sort of opened itself up to me, because I think you can draw a direct line from that to the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
That's interesting. And we were just having a conversation on Friday here. There's a Mellon Fellow, and I don't know if she's here tonight. There she is, with the National Park Service to look at areas and issues of representation and disability. And I will readily admit I'm not informed enough to have a conversation along those lines in any depth, but there is something fascinating about the idea of identifying yourself with the condition, but not necessarily publicly.
Yeah.
But not necessarily publicly identifying with the actual affects the disability of it itself in an overtly public way.
It's a really interesting, it's a complex part of the story, which is why it's the part of the story that I like the most in a lot of ways, because it's not entirely one thing or the other. I think that we're all very used to this idea of the significance of polio in FDR's life is the steps that he and his advisors went to conceal the effects of the illness from the public, which is real. From the moment it gets announced to the public, in the article in the New York Times announcing it, his doctor is quoted as saying, "No one need fear any permanent disability." They knew that was not true, but they wanted to sort of put that out there so they weren't completely closing the door on him resuming the identity of being the active man in politics. But at the same time, if you were reading newspapers in the 1920s and you knew who Franklin Roosevelt was, you were at all interested in him, you would have known that he had infantile paralysis, that he had lost the ability to walk. You would also know that he had not regained that ability. You would know that he was spending a good deal of his life in Warm Springs working on rehabilitation. And in some articles, you would see him actually talking quite frankly about not just how much of his time he had spent in his attempts to gain rehabilitation, but the effect on him emotionally of dealing with this. I was really surprised by that. And I think it's important to know that, because it's in the mix when he then reemerges in politics at the end of that decade. People know that this is someone, when he's talking about hope and the ability to come back from a moment of profound challenge, that this is someone who knows whereof he speaks. And I think that's part of the mix there that is often neglected.
Well, how did he first, Warm Springs is in rural Georgia. I'm from Alabama. We would go there to the little White House. How did he even find out about Warm Springs, of all places?
He hears about Warm Springs, Georgia in the fall of 1924. And it is described to him as this sort of miraculous haven tucked in the hills of Georgia, where there are these waters that have these sort of special curative powers that have
Isn't it interesting? There are always waters. That's not common. That's not uncommon at that era and before.
Yeah, and he, as you know, had experience in his youth going to spa resorts in Europe with his parents when his father had been ill in the final years of his life. So that was a sort of concept that resonated with him. But I think really what draws him is this idea of a miracle, because it was supposedly these waters gave other people who were paralyzed back the ability to walk again. And by that point, it was 1924. The conventional wisdom on recovery from the effects of polio was that muscle function that hadn't returned after 1 to 2 years probably wasn't coming back. And he was at 3 years at that point. So he was looking for a miracle. So I think that's in a lot of ways why he sort of jumps at it when he hears about Warm Springs. He goes down there. He's very quickly disabused of the notion that this is another one of these ultra luxe German spa resorts. My favorite sort of narrative voice in that moment on the first visit to Warm Springs is Eleanor's. She talks about lying in bed the first night and hearing squirrels running around in the ceiling above her. Their first meal, she watches the cook go out into the yard and slaughter the chicken and bring it in to cook for dinner.
Sounds just like my upbringing.
We don't judge. But he does ultimately get into the water at Warm Springs. And when he gets in that water, he has, I think, two thoughts right off the bat. One is, this does feel magical. And the second thought is, it's a shame that it's only for me. And when I think about Warm Springs, I think that's what's really quite miraculous about the place, is it unlocks this capacity for empathy and this sort of sense of mission to help others in FDR that's going to be so essential in the years to come.
And the water gives him a sense of freedom of movement in a way. He's in control of floating, and
yes,
he can control his movement within water. And that's kind of fascinating to me, that he loved to just be in the water with children, especially.
Yeah, and he had gotten that. I mean, he had gotten that before he went to Warm Springs.
Yeah, it's down in Florida. Yeah,
and here as well. But it was exactly what you're describing. This sense of there's an independence there that he didn't have in the rest of life, and I think he was aware of his privilege, and that other people who were paralysis victims did not have that same opportunity to just get in a swimming pool. And I think he understood what some of the obstacles were for them. So he knew that a lot of people, even if they had been prescribed water therapy, the option for them was to go to a public pool, where there would be no facility for them to change, and these people would be changed in front of everyone else, strangers. And I think he understood how dehumanizing that was. And one of the first things he does when he takes charge of Warm Springs is design really comfortable, warm changing rooms, private changing rooms. And I think that's quite intentional. He understood that, you need to pay attention to people's dignity. And that's where, when you talk about these principles that he develops from these years that he then applies in the presidency, I think that's a key one. It's pay attention to human dignity as a sort of starting point, and then go from there. Yeah.
It's interesting because we had a researcher from Charles University over in Prague here working on some photographic method, but part of the discovery were that some pictures of Warm Springs were actually in rich color when you applied a process. And you can see just how simple of a place it is. But one thing that's very noticeable are, in fact, those changing rooms.
Right.
You see them very clearly, so individual, right near the pool, but yet separate. It is kind of remarkable he was a man of details, though.
He loved them. Yeah.
Yeah, he loved them.
Yeah.
And it's glass enclosed ultimately, the swimming pool. So it can be used at any time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So he's thinking about these things. And during that year, of course, Warm Springs was segregated. Did he get out into the country the way he later, would ride around in the region and talk to farmers? Did he get out of the hospital setting or the compound that was Warm Springs at all during these early years into the countryside?
He certainly did. He was very interested in it. And as you know, with Franklin Roosevelt, there's always a lot going on multiple levels. And I think, even though he is devoting, this is in a lot of ways the least public portion of his life, or of his adult life, and he's devoting it chiefly to recovery, he is aware, as he is spending all his time in Georgia, that could have some benefits to him if he wants to reemerge in national politics. He was a New Yorker, but he had watched in the 1920s these terrible divides in the Democratic Party between the sort of emerging Democratic Party, which was associated with the big urban machines in the North, and the older Democratic Party in the South that sort of was very negatively disposed towards any candidate, particularly one from New York. So I think he really liked the fact that in spending all this time in Georgia, he's sort of broadening his profile and dealing with that New York problem in a way that other politicians like Al Smith weren't able to. And I think that forces us, or it forced me in working on this, to really grapple with some of the complexity and contradiction, which is that Warm Springs, which, you know, I think it's the heart of the book that I've written. I think it is the place you go to look for the sort of source of this incredible force of empathy in Franklin Roosevelt, is also in a lot of ways the site of his greatest failure of empathy. Because he is spending all this time in the Jim Crow segregated South, and he is not moved to the cause of civil rights. Now, you can say that there are, there are plenty of other Democratic politicians in that era, progressive politicians in that era, who are not moved to the cause of civil rights. Very true. But I think the greatest counter argument there is Eleanor Roosevelt. She goes down to Warm Springs for the first time, and they're sort of being toured around, and they're shown a local school for the white children. And Eleanor's question is, where do the black children go to school? What about them? And I think she was never really fully comfortable in Warm Springs for a number of reasons, but I think that the realities of the Jim Crow South were intolerable to her from the outset. And that's a tension that's going to exist in the sort of public portion of their marriage for the rest of their lives, is where she is on civil rights and where he thinks he needs to be in order to maintain his standing in the party, which is dominated by white segregationists from the South.
And that's mentioning Eleanor Roosevelt. During this period of his both self-imposed and imposed removal from public life, she's taken the exact opposite course, because she is representing now the Roosevelt name. She's collecting data and growing as a person. So how is that relationship unfolding during this 3, 4, 5, 6 year period?
Yeah, I loved the time that any time that I was spending when I was researching and writing this book, thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt and learning about Eleanor Roosevelt, was some of the most enriching, because I think in a lot of ways her transformation is even more dramatic and even more inspiring in these years. The book starts a couple of years before FDR gets polio, and it's in a lot of ways one of the least happy moments in Eleanor's life, where she's really quite lost and not aware of what her sort of purpose is and what her future is going to hold.
And she has nursed him in a way that's powerful and personal and dramatic on levels that it's hard to imagine unless you've had a close family member. And before there was the kind of medical care.
That's right. And I think, and that comes right when she is grappling with this, the illness comes as she is grappling with this question of what is her public role going to be, or what is her life going to be about? And she starts to sort of gravitate towards this idea of a life of service. And then all of a sudden he gets ill, and it looks like she's being wrenched completely back into his orbit. She spends the first winter of his recovery. You just feel her going up and down the stairs of the townhouse on East 65th Street in New York City. And her whole life is given over to the service of Franklin. And that looks to her for a moment, talk about despair, like that looks like a very bleak future for her. But then go back to that plan of Louis Howe's, which is, we're going to find other ways to keep the Roosevelt name in front of the public. I think Howe saw something in Eleanor Roosevelt that she didn't entirely see in herself, which was that she was not just Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt, she was Teddy Roosevelt's niece, and that she had quite a bit of Teddy Roosevelt in her. He encourages her to step out on that public stage and be a public figure in her own right, because I think he understands that she has that capacity. And she does it at first a little reluctantly, but very quickly she discovers that actually that's the place in a lot of ways she was always meant to be. And you see her in these years, this is before his return to politics, developing, an issue set and an agenda and a power base that is completely independent from her husband. And so you get to see her doing all of that in parallel to this incredible transformation that's happening in her husband. And then you get to see them together really remaking their marriage into this quite unique and complex union that's based on their shared sense of mission. It's not completely tidy. She's not always totally happy with him and with what some of the implications of his public life are going to be for her and for her hard-won independence. But she always comes around because I think she understands that the way that this illness has changed him and the ways that it's made him someone who can really be an effective agent for the causes she believes in most.
And it's curious, in some of the correspondence I was just looking at some this week, her engagement not just with women's groups on issues that had traditionally been associated from a social policy development with women, but also within the political sphere of the parties and helping to develop the actual women's roles within the very overtly political aspect of the Democratic Party in particular, specifically. So she's evolving personally in terms of a level of confidence, but also as she's not given enough credit as a politician.
She's quite pragmatic and in some cases quite ruthless in the best sense. I think we think about, keep in mind the moment. This is the 1920s. Women gained the right to vote nationally for the first time under the 19th Amendment in 1920.
And she was not a suffragette.
She was not. The story I love the most is when in 1920, before polio, when Franklin is the vice presidential candidate, a reporter comes and finds Eleanor and asks her what she thinks about the issue of women's suffrage. And her response is, I don't have a strong feeling either way. Personally, I'm content with my husband and my children. And this is not what we're used to hearing from Eleanor Roosevelt. So talk about the transformation. She goes from that to Eleanor Roosevelt in just a few years' time. But she realizes, so they know that women are voting, the party bosses who are all male. So they know that they need women to be sort of in the mix in the parties, but they assume that they can have them just be figureheads. And so they give them these titles, but they don't let them have any authority in terms of developing the platform of the Democratic or the Republican Party. Eleanor Roosevelt goes through some very dispiriting moments where she's educated in that reality in the 1920s. And her response is, women need to organize. They need to vote. They need to have their own leaders and vote as a bloc within the parties so that they can force the men to listen to them, and which is accurate. And it's how she ultimately does gain this independent power base in the party. But she's schooled by that harsh reality, and she responds with the harsh reality of her own. Yeah.
So 1924 election passes, which was probably best for the Democrats, for FDR anyway, to just ignore that. That wasn't going to go well for them. The emergence then after 24, 25 towards the 28 election with Al Smith and his sort of really nationally public re-emergence, is that mapped out towards that moment? Is there thought towards 32? How are they thinking politically then, FDR, as he comes now out of this moment of crisis and his character has changed?
I think there's plenty of strategery in terms of thinking about, okay, how can we keep his name out there in front of the public? So he meets on his way down to Warm Springs from New York. He'll stop off in Washington and meet with national groups of Democrats. But I think the important thing to know about that period in the late 1920s is, in his mind and in Louis Howe's mind and in Eleanor's mind, he's got more time and he wants more time. One of the most sort of bittersweet moments in a lot of ways is that moment in 1928 when Al Smith, who had been the sitting governor of New York, is the Democratic nominee for president. And he wants, for purely selfish political reasons, for Franklin Roosevelt to succeed him, to be the candidate, the Democratic candidate to succeed him as governor of New York, because he thinks Al Smith comes from New York City. Having a Roosevelt on the ticket will bring out more Democratic votes upstate that can help him to carry New York State, which was a big pivotal electoral swing state in the 1920s. So he puts pressure on Franklin Roosevelt to run as the gubernatorial candidate that year. Roosevelt doesn't at first want to run because he thinks if he can just have a little more time, spending more time at Warm Springs, focusing on rehabilitation, he thinks he can regain the ability to walk. He wasn't going to regain the ability to walk. His doctors were pretty clear on that. But in his mind, I think he thought that was quite possible. And then ultimately Smith, with the help of Eleanor, convinces him that he has to run in 1928. And I think, and what's so bittersweet about it is by that point, I think FDR realizes that this is his moment and he has to take it because it's his moment. But what he's doing in that moment is choosing a political future over a future in which he will have the ability to walk. That was very much the trade-off as he saw it, even if it wasn't actually the reality.
I believe we're going to have some questions, I think. Yes. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, right here.
I'm so glad that you brought out the name of Lewis Howe. I have always thought he was so extraordinary. Up in Albany at the time that FD stood for Feather Duster, and his fellow politicians were calling him Morning Glory because he very nice, very pretty, but wasn't going to last long. He was addressing him as my revered future president.
Yeah.
And in the same way, he saw something in Eleanor Roosevelt that nobody else saw. And he was tutoring her on her speeches, stop that giggling. And if you have something to say and sit down and developing her talents. Did you ever develop any insight into where he gained this phenomenal intuition into people?
It's a great question because I think, political consultants are not, which is what Louis Howe, if we were to give him a job description today, that's what we would call him. They're not known for their extreme emotional sensitivity. But he certainly had it, even if it wasn't what he presented to the world. For those of you who don't know, Howe had this very sort of gruff exterior. He was always disheveled. He was sort of covered in cigarette ash and newsprint, and there were great scenes from the Roosevelt family breakfast table of him barking orders at everyone. But he was this incredibly emotionally sophisticated individual. I think it comes from a number of things. He had himself throughout his life been quite ill. He had spent a lot of time in Saratoga, which is another sort of spa rehabilitative colony where there were a number of other things going on. There was also a lot of high society, and there was also a lot of politics. So for him, when you think about this sort of mix that comes into the Roosevelt's life in the 1920s, where you're focused on rehabilitation, but you're also thinking about how do you keep him in the mix for politics, this is uniquely something that Louis Howe is well suited for because it's what he had been raised in. But I still think what he does for the Roosevelts in this period is quite extraordinary because a lot, as you say, he had invested himself from an early point in Franklin Roosevelt's future. He saw the makings of a future president of the United States. Most political consultants, when the candidate that they've really devoted themselves to all of a sudden has something terrible happen to him that's going to take him out of the limelight, they would say, okay, I got to look for the next thing. Howe does the opposite. He moves into the Roosevelt's house. He devotes himself completely to Franklin Roosevelt's rehabilitation and sort of, providing for him a vision of what a better future might look like. And I think he understood that psychological piece was going to be so essential to FDR's recovery in a way that other people who were around in that moment didn't necessarily see.
And we have another question from Paul Sparrow. He wants you to tell us about Eleanor's relationships with political women like Esther Lape and Nancy Cook. Those are relationships that would remain for years and years.
Well, hi, Paul. It's an honor to be here for the Paul Sparrow Lecture. I think that's another great sort of current in this story as well, as you see Eleanor developing these very intense relationships with other women that are really tied up in what is the great cause of her life, which is sort of acting for what today we would call social justice and reform. And I think it's, it's a moment in the Roosevelts' marriage where they're spending not that much time together, which is, in a lot of marriages, maybe that's a good approach. But I think it is to Franklin's credit, in a certain sense, that he encourages Eleanor to have this independent life and he invites the women that she's working with into their inner circle, and he's very comfortable with it. I think a lot of men, whether they were in happy marriages or unhappy marriages in that moment, would have seen their wife as someone who was supposed to be of service to him. He understood that part of the deal for Eleanor was that she needed this independence and that she could be useful to both of them if she was happy and fulfilled. And so he really is comfortable with that. And so that's why I say this is such a unique and complex union. It's in a lot of ways one of the happier periods in their married life, even though they're spending less and less time together. They're quite in sync in a way, even though they're not physically in the same space.
Do we have one? I think we have time for one more question.
Mr. Darman, I have 3 questions for you. The first question is, have you been to Warm Springs?
I have.
Okay. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Warm Springs History. We were there on April 12th, 2012, and that, of course, is the anniversary of Roosevelt's death. And it's an amazing place. My second question for you is, if you could ask FDR one question, what would you ask, and what do you think his answer would be? And here's an example. I would ask FDR, if he had a chance to do over one thing in his life, what would he do differently? And his answer would have been quite obviously, well, I wouldn't have gone to Bear Mountain on July 27th, 1921, because that's where I caught polio. Do you have a question and an answer?
I mean, I think I think the period that I would like to ask him about is what Bill was talking about before, those early moments of recovery when he is in the depths of what looked like a certain amount of depression. And because most of what we know about what might have been going through his head was what other people observed. And if you could ask him the question and get him to answer it truthfully, what was really going through your head in those moments? What did it look like to you? How did your religious faith that had been an important part of his upbringing, how was that in the mix? How did you understand this illness that might have even killed you, and didn't? What was the lesson that you took away from that? He doesn't talk. I mean, I talk about this in the book. He doesn't talk directly about the lessons and the effects of polio very much in the years that follow. If you know to look for it, you see it again and again and again in his life and in the presidency, the lessons that he learns from there. But I would love to hear in his own voice exactly what he saw as those lessons, because I think that's still a mystery.
The Roosevelts were Stoics, and they didn't talk about their feelings. The last question I have for you is, we have a bill pending in the state Senate and the state assembly. I helped write it. I'm a lawyer. And I would rename the Mid-Hudson Bridge the Frank. This isn't working very well. There is nothing in the United States that is named after Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, at least not since the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute changed its name in 2009 to the Roosevelt Institute. There is a destroyer or some other Navy ship that is the SS Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, but you wouldn't know it from looking on the ship, because on the bow it says SS Roosevelt. So you don't know which Roosevelt they're talking about, Teddy or Franklin or Eleanor or all three of them. So would you support the bill by writing a letter to Governor Hochul and Lieutenant Governor Delgado, both of whom,
I need to have my executive committee study all the land
Well,
use
sure.
issues involved, but
Thanks,
I love
thanks
the
as well,
idea
yeah.
of a bridge as symbolizing the relationship between Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, because I agree that getting that both elements of it into any moment that is an opportunity to think about the Roosevelts is to the advantage of all of us as we consider their legacy in this country.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It was great. We
Thank
have to have you back
Yes,
again.
always happy to come
We didn't
back.
even talk about the children and the effect on the family.
I know.
So, Jonathan will sign a few books up front, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you.